The laughter reached the human ship 11 minutes before the weapons did, and the Draconian choir was very proud of that fact. In the dark between two cold stars, 409 Draconian war barks hung in a perfect crescent, and every mind aboard them sang the same thought at once. The thought was a sound, and the sound was meant to be heard. The choir did not fight with metal first, it fought with knowing. It pressed its certainty into the skulls of lesser races, until those races agreed that they had already lost, and then it walked into ruins that had surrendered, before a single shot was fired. For 900 years this had been enough. Whole species had laid down their arms, because the choir had simply told them, mind to mind, that resistance was a kind of madness. The one who carried this story did not have a name the way humans had names. He was a throat. He was the part of the choir that spoke outward, the mouth through which 409 ships became one voice. When the choir wished to mock, it mocked through him. And on this day, looking at the small gray shape that had folded into the gap between the stars, the choir very much wished to mock. The human ship was called the Still Hour. The throat read the name off its hull the way one reads the label on a jar. It was a single vessel, one. It measured 2,090 meters from prow to stern, which by Draconian standards made it a courier, a runner, a thing that carried messages and ran from fights. It had come alone to the edge of a system the choir had marked for correction, a system with 3 inhabited worlds that had refused the choir's song and asked Earth for help instead. Earth had sent one ship. The throat found this so funny that he let the whole choir feel it. He had reason to laugh. The choir had broken larger things than a courier. 2 centuries before, a coalition of 7 species had folded 1,100 warships into the choir's path, a true armada, guns enough to crack a planet's crust. The choir had not fired on them. The choir had sung. By the time the 1,100 ships closed to weapons range, every captain among them had already laid down his arms, because every captain among them had already become certain, deep in the marrow of his mind, that he had lost. The choir had walked through that armada the way a man walks through tall grass. It had been the easiest victory in 900 years, and the throat had savored every moment of it, and he had assumed, looking at the small gray shape called the Still Hour, that this would be easier still. One ship, not even a true warship. A messenger, by its size, a thing built to carry words and flee from fights. The throat almost felt sorry for the calm little vessel, the way you feel a flicker of pity for a single ember that has drifted out of a great fire and now sits cooling, alone, in the dark, certain it is still part of something warm. He decided he would be merciful. He would not even break it. He would simply turn it around and send it home, so that its loud blue world would hear, from its own messenger's mouth, that the choir was coming and that nothing could be done. The mockery went out as a wide pulse, the Draconian way of speaking, a pressure that any mind within a light second would feel as words pressed directly behind the eyes. The throat did not bother to be cruel about it. He was almost gentle, the way a giant is gentle with an insect it has already decided to step on. Little ship, the choir said, all 409 voices folded into one. You have come a long way to die politely. We have read your makers. We have tasted 3 of your colonies as they begged. You feel fear, the way water feels gravity. It is your nature, so we will be kind. Turn around, carry our voice home. Tell your warm little world that the choir is coming, and that nothing it builds will matter, because we will reach your sailors before your guns ever reach us. We always do. The throat waited for the human ship to flinch. He had timed it, the way he always timed it. There was a rhythm to breaking a race, a rhythm he had perfected over 9 centuries, and the first pulse was always the same. You press gently. You let them feel the size of you. You let the cold pour in behind their eyes. And then you waited, and you watched, because the flinch told you everything. The flinch told you where the fear lived in a species. Some races flinched in their leaders, and you broke the leaders. Some flinched in their warriors, and you broke the warriors. Some, the saddest, flinched everywhere at once, and those you barely had to touch. This was the moment he loved. In 900 years, he had felt 10,000 species feel that first pressure, and they all did the same thing. Their minds clenched. Their leaders broadcast on every channel at once, shouting orders, shouting prayers, shouting numbers, filling the dark with the loud panicked noise of creatures trying to convince themselves they were still in control. The choir fed on that noise. It told the choir exactly where the fear lived, and fear was a door. The human ship did not get loud. The human ship got quiet. The throat noticed it the way a swimmer notices the water has gone cold. The still hour had been giving off the ordinary murmur any crude vessel gives off, the low background hum of 10,000 living minds doing 10,000 small things. And then, between one of the throat's heartbeats and the next, that murmur thinned. It did not panic. It did not scatter. It folded inward and went still, the way a hand closes into a fist. He had never felt a race do that on purpose. There was a name for what the human ship had done, though the throat did not know it yet. The humans called it going dark. It was a thing their warships were trained to do, a discipline drilled into every crew across 100 years, because the humans had learned, listening to the choir break world after world, that the one thing that fed the enemy was noise. Panic was noise. Prayer was noise. Shouted orders were noise. So the humans had taught themselves the opposite of panic. When the pressure came, when the cold poured in behind their eyes, they did not shout. They breathed. They went quiet. They folded inward and they waited, calm as stones, and they gave the listening enemy nothing to find. It was the hardest thing in the world to teach a frightened mind to do, and the humans had spent 3 generations teaching it, and now, in the dark between 2 dead stars, 10,000 of them did it at once. The choir, 409 ships strong, leaned closer in the dark to listen, and for the first time in 9 centuries, when it listened, it heard nothing at all. The throat told himself it meant nothing, a trick of distance. A dead ship perhaps, its crew already fled. He pushed harder, through the mockery again, sharper now, laced with images of the 3 colonies the choir had already broken, the surrender songs it had pulled out of them, the way their leaders had wept and thanked the choir for the privilege of giving up. The human ship answered. It was not a shout. It was one line, sent on a single old radio frequency, in plain spoken words, slow enough that even the slowest translator could follow. A woman's voice, calm, almost bored, the voice of someone reading a weather report. This is the still hour, Commander Elise Brandt speaking, to the fleet calling itself the choir. We received your message. We are not going to argue with it. We are simply going to make it so that you can never send another one. The throat felt the whole choir bristle at the insult. 409 ships, threatened by 1 courier and a calm woman. He almost laughed again. He drew breath to crush her, to flood that little hull with so much certainty that her crew would open their own airlocks, just to make the pressure stop. He never got the chance to begin. Because the still hour did the one thing the choir had no answer for. It did not get louder than the choir. No mind could do that. Instead, very gently, it reached across the dark and turned the volume of the entire universe down to 0. The throat's first warning was that he could no longer feel ship 409. Not destroyed, not silenced by death, which has a sound of its own. A last bright flare a mind makes when it ends. This was worse than death. Ship 409 simply stopped being part of the choir, the way a word stops being part of a sentence when you take it out. One moment it was there, singing with the others. The next there was a hole in the song shaped exactly like a ship, and out of that hole came nothing. No fear, no final thought, no body for the choir to grieve. Just absence, clean and total, as if the vessel and its 1,100 minds had never been born. The throat spun the choir's attention toward that hole, demanding to know what had happened. And he watched, helpless, as the hole began to grow. The throat had felt ships die. He had not felt ships erased. He needed to understand the difference before it ate the whole fleet. So he did what the choir did best. He listened harder. That was his second mistake. When a Draconian mind reaches out to listen, it opens. The whole strength of the choir came from this openness. 409 ships pouring their attention into a single shared space, a vast warm room where every thought belonged to everyone. It made them mighty. It also meant that whatever entered that room was instantly in every head at once. For 900 years nothing had dared enter it. Everything that touched the choir was smaller than the choir, and so the choir simply swallowed it. The still hour did not enter the room. The still hour took the room away. The throat would spend the rest of his short remaining time trying to describe it, and he would fail, because the thing the human ship did had no draconian word. The nearest he could reach was this. Imagine a chorus that has sung together so long that the singers no longer know where their own voice ends and the others begin. Now imagine that someone, somewhere, very gently, begins to remove the air. Not the singers, the air, the thing that carries the song from throat to ear. The singers keep singing, they feel themselves singing, but the song goes nowhere, reaches no one, and one by one each singer realizes he is alone, in a silence so complete he cannot even hear himself. That was what spread out of the hole where Ship 409 had been. The humans called it a quiet field. The throat learned the name later, much later, in the hour when he finally understood that the still hour had been built for exactly one purpose, and that purpose was the choir. Earth had studied the Draconian way of war for 60 years. It had watched the choir break species after species without firing a shot, watched the surrender songs go out, watched whole civilizations talk themselves into the grave, and Earth had asked a single cold question that no victim of the choir had ever lived long enough to ask. If they win by being heard, what happens if we make it so they cannot be heard at all? The still hour was the answer. It carried no great fleet-killing cannons across its first kilometers of hull. It carried emitters, thousands of them, woven through the gray skin of the ship like nerves under skin, and every one of them did the same simple, terrible thing. It poured out a field that did to thought what a thick wall does to sound. Inside that field, no mind could reach another. The link that made the choir a choir, the warm shared room, the song, the certainty pressed behind the eyes, all of it required one thing to function. It required that one mind be able to touch another across the dark. The still hour made the dark untouchable. Ship 409 had not been killed. It had been cut off, severed from the choir so completely that to the rest of the fleet it had simply ceased to exist, because in 900 years, no Draconian had ever experienced another Draconian as anything but a voice in the shared room. Take away the room and the Draconian aboard Ship 409 were still alive, still breathing, still sitting at their stations. They just could not feel a single other living thing in the universe, including each other, including the one standing 3 feet away. The throat did not know any of this yet. He only knew that the hole was growing, and that it was coming for him. He gave the order to fire. It was the obvious order. They were warships. The little human courier was a single target. 408 remaining barks could throw enough fire to vaporize a moon. So the throat reached into the shared room to spread the order, to coordinate the volley, to tell every gunner across the crescent to align on the still hour, and fire as one. He reached into the room, and the room was smaller than it had been a minute ago. Ships 409 through 390 were simply gone from it. 20 ships, scooped out of the choir, leaving 20 holes. The throat could still see them on the old optical sensors, hanging there in the crescent, perfectly intact, running lights still on. But he could not reach them. He could not give them the order. They were 2,000 meters of hull, and 1,100 living minds each, and they had become as deaf to him as the cold rock of the dead stars. So the order went out crippled, to 389 ships instead of 409, and 389 ships fired. The volley was beautiful, and it was useless. The still hour did not dodge. It did not raise a shield, because it had something better than a shield. It had a problem the choir had never solved, which was that Draconian gunnery had been built for 900 years on the assumption that the gunner and the targeting mind and the fleet's shared sight were all one connected web. A Draconian did not aim the way a human aimed. He felt the target through the room, through the shared sight of 400 ships triangulating as one, and he let the room tell his hands where to point. It was faster than any computer. It was deadlier than any computer. And it required the room. The still hour had eaten the room. Inside the quiet field, every Draconian gunner went suddenly, totally blind in the only way that mattered. His eyes still worked. His instruments still worked. But the shared sight that he had trusted his whole life, the great web of fleet vision that turned 400 ships into one perfect eye, was gone, and he had never once in his life learned to aim without it. 389 ships fired at a target they could no longer collectively see, each gunner alone for the first time, each one guessing. Their fire went wide. It went wide by kilometers. Streams of plasma and lance fire poured into the empty dark, where the shared sight had told them the human ship would be, and the human ship was not there, because the shared sight was a corpse, and a corpse cannot lead. There was a young gunner aboard one of those 389 ships, though the throat would never know his name, because the throat had never known any of their names. No Draconian had names the human way. They had places in the song. This young one had been a place in the song for 40 years, a bright, clear voice on the third gun deck of a ship near the western wing, and he had aimed his weapon 10,000 times in his life, and he had never once missed, because he had never once aimed alone. When the room went out of him, he did not understand it. He felt his hands on the firing yoke. He felt his eyes on the target board, but the board was empty in the way that mattered, because the board had never been the thing he aimed with. He had aimed with the fleet, with the great shared web of 400 sights folded into one, and now the web was gone, and there was only him, one small frightened mind that had never in 40 years had to find a target by itself. He fired anyway, because firing was the only thing he knew how to do, and his shot went into the empty dark a full degree off, and he did not even know it had missed, because the thing that used to tell him whether he had hit was the room, and the room was gone. He sat there afterward, in the silence, listening for the others. He could not hear the others. He could not hear the captain. He could not hear the gunner who had sat beside him for 40 years, close enough to touch. He reached out, the only way he had ever reached, and there was nothing to reach, and he began, slowly, to understand that there would never again be anything to reach, and he was 40 years old, and he had never once been alone, and now he would be alone forever. He did not fire again. There was no point. There was no one to fire for. A few shots, by pure chance, found the still hour. They struck the gray hull and they stopped. The humans had not skimped on armor while they built their silence. The still hour shrugged off the scattered hits the way a man shrugs off rain, and it kept doing the only thing it had come to do. It kept turning down the volume of the universe, one ship at a time. The throat felt the next 20 go, then 40. The quiet field was not a wave that washed over everything at once. It was a tide, and it had a shape, and the shape was deliberate. The humans were not erasing the choir randomly. They were peeling it. They took the ships at the edges of the crescent first, the wings, the flanks, the places where a fleet thinks least about itself. Each ship that fell out of the room made the room smaller. Each shrinking of the room made the surviving ships easier to find, easier to peel, because a smaller choir is a quieter choir, and a quieter choir cannot hide its members in the noise of the whole. The throat finally understood, dimly, that the humans were doing to the choir exactly what the choir had done to 10,000 worlds. They were using the choir's own greatest strength to destroy it. The choir won by making its victims feel alone. The still hour was making the choir feel alone. And the choir, which had never once in 900 years been alone, had no defense against it whatsoever. It was a creature of the warm, shared room. Take the room away and you did not weaken it. You unmade it. He could feel the shape of the dying as it spread, and the shape of it was a kind of mathematics no Draconian had ever had to learn. The choir had always thought of itself as a single thing, a number that could only grow or hold. 409. It had never imagined that number going down, because nothing had ever made it go down, and so the choir had never built a way to think about loss. Now the number was falling, and with every ship that fell, the ships that remained did not simply become fewer. They became weaker than fewer. The room was not a pile of voices you could subtract from one at a time. It was a fabric, and the strength of every thread came from being woven into all the others, and when you began to pull threads out, the whole cloth did not shrink evenly. It tore. It ran. A small loss at the edge became a large loss in the middle, and a large loss in the middle became a collapse everywhere at once, and the throat, who had spent 900 years certain that the choir was the strongest thing in the dark, felt it come apart in his hands like wet paper. There was nothing he could do, because everything he knew how to do required the very thing that was being taken away. He could not order a defense, because ordering required the room. He could not pull the fleet into a tighter formation, because formation was a thing the room flew, not the hulls. He could not even tell the surviving ships to hold steady, because the words would not reach them. And even if they reached them, the ships had no way to obey. No captain in 900 years having ever held a wheel or pushed a lever. Every motion of every vessel having always flowed from the shared will that the human ship was quietly cutting to pieces. The choir was not losing a battle. It was discovering that it had never known how to fight one alone, and that it had spent 9 centuries being mighty in exactly the one way that could be taken from it in an afternoon. He tried one other thing first, before the song. He tried to send boarders. It was the oldest instinct a warrior has. If the enemy is too clever to fight at range, you close the distance, and you put bodies through his hull, and you take him apart with your hands. The throat still had ships in the room, ships with troops aboard, hard, sharp Draconians bred to fight in the close dark of a breached corridor. He gave the order to launch them, to fold the troop pods across the short gap, and tear open the little gray ship, and silence the thing inside it that was silencing the choir. The troop pods launched. The throat felt them go. And the moment they crossed into the quiet field, the same thing happened to them that had happened to everything else. The pilots of the pods steered by mind. The troops inside coordinated by mind. A boarding swarm that moved as one creature, a single will pouring through 40 bodies. Inside the field there was no single will. There were 40 separate frightened animals in 40 separate metal shells, each one suddenly alone, each one unable to feel the others. And a boarding swarm that cannot feel itself is not a swarm. It is 40 lost things drifting in the dark. The pods scattered. Some struck the hull and clung there, useless, their occupants hammering at armor they had no plan to breach because the plan had lived in the room. None of them got inside. The still hour did not even seem to notice them. It had armor for that too. So the throat went back to the only weapon he had left, the weapon that had never failed in 900 years. He poured himself into what was left of the shared space, and he sang the old battle song, the certainty song, the song that had broken empires. He sang that they were the choir, that they were many, that they were strong, that the little gray ship was a trick and a lie, and that any moment now the human courier would run out of whatever clever thing it was doing, and the choir would crush it as it had crushed everything. For a moment, the song worked. The surviving ships took it up. The throat felt them rally, felt the certainty come back, felt the crescent steady itself. And then the human voice came again, on that same old plain radio frequency, the same calm woman, Commander Elise Brandt, reading her weather report. "We can hear you singing," she said. "We just don't care." The quiet field surged. Not at the wings this time, straight through the heart. The throat felt 100 ships drop out of the room between one breath and the next. 100. The whole center of the crescent, the command barks, the ships closest to his own, the strongest voices in the choir, the ones whose certainty had been holding the rest together. They went out like 100 candles pinched at once, and the song the throat was singing collapsed in his mouth, because there was suddenly no one left to sing it with. He was, for the first time in his life, nearly alone in the room. It is hard to explain what that did to him. A human who has always had company can imagine loneliness, because a human is born alone and learns company afterward. A Draconian is born into the room. He has never, not for 1 second from the moment his mind opened, been without the warm pressure of other minds around him. It is his air. The throat had spent 900 years certain, down to the floor of himself, that he could never truly be alone, that the room was eternal, that even in death a Draconian simply rejoined the great chorus. Now the room had perhaps 60 ships left in it, and they were terrified, and their terror was the only thing he could feel, and underneath it, rising, was a silence so vast it had a texture. He could feel the edges of his own mind. He had never felt the edges of his own mind. He had never known he had edges. The quiet pressed against them, and he understood, with a horror that no surrender song had ever produced in any victim, that the silence outside was about to become the silence inside, and that when it did, he would not die. He would simply be alone forever, inside a body that still worked. He did the thing the choir had never done. He gave the order to retreat. It went out to the 60 ships still in the room, and 40 of them did not hear it, because between the giving of the order and its arrival, the quiet field had taken them too. 20 ships answered. 20, out of 409. They lit their fold drives, the great engines that tore an opening in space, and let a ship step across the light years, and they reached for the dark to escape. The still hour had thought of that too. The humans had not built a weapon to win one battle. They had built a weapon to end a way of war, and a way of war that runs on a fleet escaping to spread its certainty somewhere else is a way of war that depends on ships being able to leave. So the quiet field did one more thing, the last thing the throat would have believed possible, the thing that turned a victory into an erasure. A Draconian fold drive was not a machine in the human sense. It was grown, and it was steered by mind. The pilot did not push buttons. He sang the ship through the fold, held the opening stable with his own certainty, kept the vessel whole across the impossible crossing by sheer focused will shared through the room. It was the most beautiful thing the Draconians did, and it was the most fragile, because it required, more than anything else they did, a mind that could reach. Inside the quiet field, 20 pilots reached for the fold, and their minds touched nothing. The folds opened. The throat felt them open, felt the 20 ships begin to cross, and then he felt the pilots lose their grip, every one of them, alone in the silence with no room to steady them, no shared certainty to hold the opening, no choir to sing the ship home. The folds did not close cleanly. They did not close at all. 20 ships stepped halfway into the dark between the stars, and the dark, untended, simply kept them. They did not explode. There was no fire. There was no sound. There was nothing for the optical sensors to record except 20 places in space where a ship had been, and then, very gently, was not. No debris, no bodies, no final bright flare. Just the clean, total absence the throat had felt at the very beginning, when ship 409 first fell out of the world, multiplied by 20, and he understood at last what the human commander had meant. We are simply going to make it so that you can never send another one. Not the ships, the voice, the choir itself, the thing that made the Draconians the terror of 900 years. The humans were not killing a fleet. They were deleting a kind of war from the universe, quietly, completely, without a single sound for anyone to hear, or mourn, or learn from. The throat looked at the room. There were 11 ships left in it now, then 9, then 6. He was, for the first time, beginning to feel the edges of the silence inside his own skull. And on the old plain radio frequency, the only frequency the humans ever used, the calm woman spoke once more. "We're almost done," Commander Elise Brandt said. "We left you for last. We wanted you to feel what every world you broke felt, right at the end, when they finally understood that no one was coming, and no one could hear them scream. We wanted you to feel it once, just once. Then you're going to feel nothing at all, and you're going to deserve every second of it." The throat opened his mouth to answer. There was no one left in the room to hear him. There is a thing that happens to a mind when it is finally, truly alone, and the throat experienced all of it in the span of about 90 seconds. First came denial. He told himself the room was still there, that the others had only gone quiet, that any moment the song would swell back up around him. He reached for ship after ship by name, the names he had carried for centuries, the voices he knew better than his own. Each name went out into the silence and came back with nothing attached. He kept reaching anyway, the way a tongue keeps going to the gap where a tooth used to be. Then came bargaining, which for a Draconian took the form of the surrender song, except he had never learned to sing it. The choir had never surrendered. It had received surrenders. So when the throat reached for the words a defeated mind uses, he found the choir had never made any, because it had never imagined needing them. There was no Draconian way to say "I yield." There was only the human voice on the radio, calm and patient, telling him that yielding would not have helped him anyway. Then came anger, and the anger was the strangest of all, because there was no one to aim it at. A Draconian's anger had always been a shared thing, a heat that passed through the room and grew as it passed, 400 ships feeding one another's fury until it became a weapon. The throat reached for that heat now, and found only himself, one small cold mind, and the anger he found there was a tiny, useless, private thing, with no room to grow in, and no one to share it with, and it guttered out almost as soon as it lit, the way a flame gutters in a sealed jar. He had never been angry alone before. He discovered that anger alone is not strength. It is just another kind of loneliness, and it burns the one who holds it and reaches no one else. And a creature that has only ever been angry in a crowd has no idea how to carry it by himself. And then, finally, came the thing the throat had spent 900 years giving to others and had never once received. Understanding. He understood the 3 colonies now. He could not feel them, could not pull their old surrender songs out of the shared room to mock the humans with, because the room was gone. But he remembered them, and for the first time he remembered them from the inside. 3 worlds that had refused the choir. 3 worlds the choir had broken with the song, pressing certainty into the minds of every living thing until those minds agreed they had already lost. He had thought of it, always, as a mercy. The choir did not burn worlds, it simply convinced them. What was kinder than convincing? He understood now that it had not been kind at all. He remembered a world the choir had broken 300 years before, a green world of patient, careful people who had built their whole civilization on the idea that no one should ever be left alone. They had a custom there. When a person was dying, the whole village came and sat with them, so that no one crossed out of life without a hand to hold. The choir had found this custom, and had understood, with the cold cleverness it was so proud of, exactly how to use it. It had not attacked the warriors of that world. It had attacked the custom. It had pressed into every mind on the planet a single certainty, that they were each, finally, utterly alone, that the hands they thought they held were not really there, that the whole warm web of their people had only ever been a comforting lie. And the people of that green world, who could not imagine a life without one another, had simply lain down and stopped, all of them, because the choir had taken the one thing they had built their lives around, and shown them, falsely, that they had never had it at all. The throat had sung over that world as it died. He had enjoyed it. He remembered enjoying it. And now, in the silence, he understood for the first time that the certainty he had pressed into them had been the cruelest lie ever told, because they had not been alone. Their hands had been real, the web had been real. He had simply built a wall between each of them and all of it, in the last hour of their lives, so that they died believing the truest thing about themselves had never existed. He understood, sitting in his own silence now, that this was the cruelty the humans had measured out to him, and that they had measured it carefully, and that they had given him not one drop more than he had given the green world. He understood that the worst thing you can do to a living mind is not to hurt it. It is to take away every other living mind, to leave it certain it is alone, to make sure that when it finally breaks, there is no one to hear it break. That was what the choir had done to 10,000 species. It had not killed them. It had isolated them inside their own surrender, made them feel that the whole universe agreed they should give up, that resistance was madness, because no one, anywhere, was resisting. The certainty had been a lie. There had always been others. The choir had simply made sure no victim could feel them, and the humans had heard about it. Somehow, across the cold dark, on those plain old radio frequencies that the choir had always dismissed as the babble of a loud and primitive race, the humans had heard about the worlds the choir broke, and the humans had not panicked, and the humans had not surrendered, and the humans had asked the one question that mattered. Not how do we shout louder than the choir. You could not. The choir was the loudest thing in 900 years of war. The question was, how do we make sure no one has to? The still hour was not a weapon of noise. It was a weapon of silence, the most human thing the throat had ever encountered. Because only a race that had spent its whole history learning to live with other minds it could not read, learning to trust strangers it could not feel, learning to be alone together in the dark, would ever have thought of silence as a kingdom worth building. The humans did not need the room. They had never had a room. Every human had always been alone inside his own skull, walled off from every other human, able to reach across that wall only with clumsy, slow words, with radio, with plain-spoken sentences read like weather reports. The choir had laughed at this for centuries. Look at them, the choir had sung. Look at how they shout. Look at how they fill the dark with noise because they cannot do the simplest thing, cannot touch one another mind to mind, cannot be a choir. How weak, how loud, how alone. It had never occurred to the choir that a race born alone would be the one race in the universe the silence could not touch. The throat thought about the human commander's voice. He had been listening to it crackle across that primitive old radio frequency for the whole of the battle, and at first, he had heard only its flatness, its boredom, its insulting calm. Now, in the clarity that the silence gave him, he heard something else underneath it. He heard that the calm was not boredom, it was discipline. It was a mind holding itself perfectly steady on purpose, the way a hand holds a blade steady when the cut must be exact. The woman was not bored, she was furious. She had been furious for 30 years, the way the human race had been furious for 60, and she had taken all of that fury and pressed it down into a voice that read weather reports, because she had understood the one thing the choir had never understood, which was that a quiet fury is the only kind that wins. The choir's fury was loud, it sang, it announced itself. It pressed itself behind the eyes of every victim, so that the victim would know exactly who was destroying him, and would feel, in his last moment, the full weight of the choir's enjoyment. The human fury did not announce itself. It built a ship in secret for 60 years. It learned the enemy's song so well that it could write the enemy's silence. It came a very long way without a word, and it did its work without a sound, and the only voice it allowed itself was flat and calm and merciless, because the humans had decided, long ago, that they would never give the choir the satisfaction of hearing them shout. It had never occurred to the choir that the quietest enemy was the one to fear. The throat felt the quiet field reach his own ship at last. He had time, in the final moments, to see it clearly, the way drowning men are said to see their whole lives. He saw the still hour through his optical sensors, the only sense he had left, 2,090 meters of gray hull turning slowly in the dark, unhurried, surrounded by the silent, intact corpses of 400 Draconian warships that were not corpses at all, that were full of living crew sitting deaf and blind at their stations, every one of them alone now, every one of them feeling for the first time what every broken world had felt. He saw that the still hour had not fired a single shot to do this. The scattered hits at the start had been the choir's own panic, the choir firing on nothing. The human ship had crossed an entire battle without once needing to kill. It had simply turned the volume down. It had walked into the loudest fleet in 900 years and made it quiet, and a quiet choir was not a wounded choir. It was no choir at all. It was 400 lonely ships, full of lonely strangers, who had never learned one another's faces, because they had never needed faces, who had known each other only as voices, and the voices were gone. The radio spoke again. Commander Elise Brandt, the weather report. "You're the last one," she said, "the one you call the throat, the mouth of the choir. We know what you are. We've been listening to you for 60 years, every time you broke a world, every time you sang another species into the grave. You always saved a piece of yourself to gloat with. You always made sure the dying world heard you enjoying it. So we saved you for last, and we made sure you'd be awake for all of it. And now we're going to do to you the one thing you did to everyone else. We're going to leave." The throat did not understand at first. "Leave? We're not going to kill you," the human voice said. "Killing you would be a mercy, and you don't get one. Your ship works. Your air works. Your crew is alive, all 1,100 of them, sitting right where they are. You're going to drift here, in the dark, between two dead stars, with 400 ships full of your own people, close enough to touch and forever out of reach. You'll be able to see their running lights. You'll never feel another mind again, not one, not for the rest of your life. We took the room, and we're not giving it back, and there is no one anywhere in the universe who can hear you now. That's what you did to 10,000 worlds. Sit in it." The quiet field closed over the throat's ship like water over a stone. And he learned in that moment the difference between knowing a thing and feeling it. He had known, intellectually, what the silence would be. He had felt the others fall into it, and he had braced himself, certain that he, the throat, the strongest voice in the choir, would endure it better than the rest. He had been wrong in the way that the proud are always wrong. The silence did not arrive as an absence. It arrived as a presence, vast and total, pressing in from every side at once, and the first thing it took from him was the comfortable lie that he had ever been the choir. He had not been the choir. He had been one small mind that happened to stand at the front of a great warm crowd, and he had mistaken the warmth of the crowd for his own strength. the way a coal in a fire mistakes the fire's heat for its own. Now the fire was out, and he was just a coal, cold, and small, and alone, and he had 900 years of memory of how loud and how mighty he had once felt, which made the silence so much worse than it could ever have been for a creature that had known nothing else. He reached out one final time. He did not reach for the choir. There was no choir. He reached, without meaning to, without even understanding the impulse, for the one mind he could still detect in the universe, the human ship, the still hour. He reached for it, the way a man falling reaches for anything, and his reaching mind brushed the edge of the quiet field, and the field let him feel exactly one thing before it closed him out forever. It let him feel that the humans were not gloating. That was the part that broke him. Not the silence, the discovery, in the last instant before the silence took everything, that the calm woman on the radio had not been enjoying this. There had been no warmth of triumph coming off the still hour, no song of victory, no pleasure in the kill, because there had been no kill. There had only been a quiet, steady, terrible purpose, the purpose of a people who had decided that the choir's way of war must end, and who had come a very long way to end it, and who had done so the way you put out a fire, without hatred, without glee, because the fire is not your enemy. The fire is simply a thing that must not be allowed to spread. The humans did not hate the choir. The choir was beneath hating. The choir was a kind of weather, a thing that had to be made to stop. And the worst insult, the final unbearable insult to a creature that had spent 9 centuries being the most important and most feared thing in the galaxy, was to be ended not in fury, not in vengeance, but in the same calm tone you would use to read a weather report. Then the field closed, and the throat felt nothing. He did not die. The human commander had told the truth. His ship worked. His air worked. His 1,100 crew were alive, sitting at their stations, each one alone now, inside a silence that would not end. 400 ships full of strangers, who would never again know they were not the last living thing in creation. And the still hour, having said everything it came to say, turned its gray prow toward the 3 colonies it had come to save, and began, without sound, to leave. The 3 colonies had names the choir had never bothered to learn, because the choir had filed them all under the same word, which meant something close to corrected. They were called Tellan, Owari, and the Brace. And on each of them lived peoples who had spent a generation under the certainty the choir had pressed into their skies. The choir had not occupied them with soldiers. It had not needed to. It had simply parked a single bark in orbit above each world, and let the song fall, day after day, year after year, a low constant pressure that told every mind below that resistance was madness, that the choir was eternal, that no help would ever come, because no help could exist, because if help existed, the choir would have felt it, and the choir felt everything. The people of Tellan had a word for the feeling. They called it the lid. It sat over the whole world, invisible, heavier than air, and under it every thought that turned toward freedom, slowed and dimmed, and finally lay down. Children grew up under the lid, never having felt a clear sky. Their parents grew old under it, certain in their bones that the universe agreed they should be quiet, that anyone who spoke of fighting was sick, that the only sane thing was to give up gracefully, and hope the choir's corrections would be gentle. What none of them knew, what the choir had made sure none of them could know, was that the lid was a lie. Help did exist. Help had heard them. 60 years before, a slow, loud, primitive race, far across the dark, had picked up the faint old radio echoes of 3 worlds, asking for someone, anyone, and that race had not been able to feel the choir's certainty at all, because that race had no shared room for the certainty to enter. The song that flattened 10,000 species simply slid off the humans like rain off stone. They could not be told they were alone. They had always been alone. It was the only world they had ever lived in. So the humans had built the still hour in secret, and they had spent 60 years learning the exact shape of the choir's song, so they could build its perfect opposite, and they had told no one, because a plan the choir could overhear was a plan already lost. And then one quiet day, a single gray ship had folded into the gap between 2 dead stars, and a calm woman had read a weather report, and the loudest fleet in 900 years had been turned off like a lamp. The people of Tellan did not feel it happen. They felt what came after. The bark in their sky went silent first. The crew aboard it, 1,100 Draconians who had spent a generation pressing the lid down onto a world, were inside the quiet field now, alone in their hull, and the song stopped. It did not fade. It stopped, all at once, the way a held breath stops. And on the surface of Tellon, for the first time in a generation, a child looked up at the sky and felt nothing pressing down. The child did not have words for it. None of them did, at first. They only knew that the lid was gone, that the heavy, invisible certainty that had sat over every thought had simply lifted, and that the morning was very, very quiet, and that the quiet was the best thing any of them had ever felt. People came out of their homes. They looked up. They looked at each other. They began, slowly, to remember that they had once meant to fight, and that the wanting to fight had not been a sickness after all, that it had been the truest and bravest thing in them, and that something had been sitting on it for a generation, and that the something was gone. The same morning came to Owari. Owari was a water world, a place of long gray seas and floating cities, and its people had suffered the choir's song in their own particular way. The choir had pressed into them a certainty that the sea would take them, that every storm was the last storm, that there was no point in building the great wave walls their engineers kept designing, because the walls would fail and the cities would drown, and nothing they did would matter. So the people of Owari had stopped building. They had let their floating cities go soft and slow, had stopped repairing the wave walls, had drifted for a generation in a gray despair that felt, from the inside, exactly like wisdom. They had called it accepting the sea. It had not been acceptance. It had been the song. When the bark above Owari went silent, the despair lifted like fog burning off the water, and the engineers of Owari woke at their desks, with their old designs still spread in front of them, and they looked at the designs, and they remembered that they had once meant to build something, and they could not understand why they had stopped. They began to build that same morning. Within a year the wave walls stood. The sea did not take them. The sea had never been going to take them. The choir had simply convinced a whole world to drown itself slowly, out of a despair that was not even their own. The same morning came to the brace. The brace was the strangest of the three, a single vast canyon world where the people lived in the walls of a chasm so deep it had its own weather, and they had resisted the choir longest because they were a stubborn, argumentative, loud people, much like the humans, and the song had taken a long time to flatten them. But it had flattened them in the end. The choir had pressed into the brace, a certainty that their stubbornness was a sickness, that their endless arguing was the thing holding them back, that a truly wise people would simply agree, and be quiet, and accept. And the people of the brace, who had argued joyfully for 10,000 years, had fallen silent, one by one, each of them privately ashamed of the loud arguing soul inside him, each of them certain that the quiet the choir offered was the grown-up thing, the wise thing, the right thing. When the song lifted from the brace, the arguing came back, and it came back like a flood, and it was the most beautiful sound that Canyon had heard in a generation. 10 million voices all disagreeing at once, gloriously, joyfully, alive. The people of the brace had learned the thing the choir had spent a generation trying to make them forget, which was that a loud, arguing, disagreeing people is a free people, and that the quiet the choir offered had never been wisdom at all. It had been a leash. There was an old woman on the brace named Joanna Vree, who had been a girl when the song first fell, and who had spent her whole life slowly forgetting the sound of her own opinions. She had argued, once, as a child. She remembered that. She remembered being loud, and being told she was loud, and being proud of it. And then the lid had come down, and year by year she had grown quieter, and had told herself that this was what it meant to grow up, to settle, to accept. On the morning the song lifted, Joanna Vree was 81 years old, and she woke in her stone house in the wall of the canyon, and felt, for the first time in 70 years, the loud arguing girl inside her sit up and look around. She did not understand what had changed. She only knew that she suddenly, fiercely, wanted to disagree with someone about something, anything, and that the wanting felt like coming home. She went out into the morning, and she found her neighbors already gathered in the street, all of them blinking in the new quiet, and she said the first loud thing that came into her head, and her neighbor argued back, and the two of them stood in the street and argued joyfully about nothing at all, and Joanna Vrie cried while she did it, because she had not known, until that morning, how much of herself the choir had taken, or that it could ever be given back. Nobody on the brace ever learned that a single gray ship 2 systems away had done it. They only knew that one morning they had woken up, and the lid was gone, and they were loud again, and they spent the rest of their lives being as loud as they could, because they had learned, in the most painful possible way, exactly what the quiet had cost them, and they were determined never to pay it again. 3 worlds woke at once, from a sleep they had not known was a sleep, and not one of them ever learned the full shape of what had saved them, because the thing that saved them had been built to leave no sound. Up in the dark, between the 2 dead stars, the throat drifted in his silent ship and watched the still hour go. He could still see. That was the cruelty of it, the precise human cruelty, that they had taken his reach, but left him his eyes. So he watched the gray ship turn its prow toward Tellin, and he watched it move off through the field of intact, silent barks, 400 war vessels, hanging motionless in the dark, each one a tomb that held living people, and he understood that this image, this exact image, was the thing the humans wanted the galaxy to find. Because the galaxy would find it. That was the genius of the silence, the part the choir would never have been clever enough to think of. The choir had ruled by being heard. The humans ruled by what they left behind. 400 warships, undamaged, drifting, full of crews who could not die, and could not speak, and could not feel, arranged in a perfect crescent around the empty place where one small gray ship had stood. No wreckage to study, no weapon to reverse engineer, no battle to analyze, because there had been no battle, only an absence that arrived and stayed. Any race that came upon this place would understand instantly and completely the one thing the humans wanted understood. This is what happens to a choir that mocks Earth. The throat thought, in his endless silence, about how many races would come and look. The choir had enemies, of course. 900 years of correction makes enemies, even of the corrected. Word would spread, slow and loud, the human way, on radio waves, and in plain-spoken sentences, carried hull to hull across the dark. They would say a fleet of 400 met one human ship. They would say there was no battle. They would say the human ship turned the choir off, and that the crews are still up there, alive, alone, drifting, and that you can see their running lights, and that not one of them will ever feel another mind for as long as it lives. And every race that had ever trembled under the choir's song would hear that story, and something inside them, the part the choir had spent centuries pressing flat, would slowly stand back up. The throat thought about the other species the choir had broken over 900 years, the 10,000 worlds filed under the word that meant corrected. He thought about how many of them still lived, flattened, quiet, drifting under their own private songs, the way Owari had drifted under its gray despair. The choir had not killed most of them. The choir rarely killed. It left worlds alive but silenced, leashed, certain in their bones that resistance was madness, and then it moved on to the next world, and the leashed world stayed leashed, generation after generation, because the certainty did not need the bark to remain. Once it was pressed deep enough into a people, it held on its own. He understood now that every one of those worlds was about to hear the story, not the song. The choir's songs died with the choir, the story. The plain, loud human story of a single gray ship that walked into 400 warships and turned them off without a sound, and it would spread on radio waves and in spoken words, world to world, the slow way, the human way, and it would reach every leashed and flattened people the choir had ever broken. And when it reached them, the certainty that held them down would meet something it had no answer for. It would meet proof that the certainty was a lie. It would meet the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had refused, and had won, and had not even raised his voice to do it. The choir had ruled by certainty. The humans had ended it with a story, and a story, unlike a song, does not need a shared room to spread. It only needs to be true, and to be told, and to be impossible to forget. The humans had made very sure of all three. There was one more thing the throat saw, in the long days before the human ship finished its work and turned for home, and it was the thing that finally made him understand the full shape of what had been done to him. A ship came. Not a human ship. It was small and battered, and it bore the markings of a species the choir had broken 200 years before. A quiet, gray people who had drifted ever since under the certainty the choir had pressed into them. The little ship had heard the first echoes of the story, the rumor of a place where the choir had ended, and it had come, carefully, fearfully, to see whether the rumor was true. It folded out at the edge of the silent crescent, and it sat there. And the throat felt it come, on his old optical sensors, and for one wild instant, something in him that had been a predator for 900 years stirred and wanted to sing, to reach out and press the old certainty into the newcomer, to make this small frightened thing lie down the way 10,000 worlds had lain down. He reached for the song. There was no song. There was no room to carry it, no choir to swell it, no reach in him at all. He was a silenced thing in a silenced ship, and the small gray newcomer could not feel him, would never feel him, was as safe from him as if he had never existed. And the throat understood, watching the little ship drift unharmed through the crescent of 400 silenced warships, that this was the true shape of the human victory. It was not that the choir had lost a battle. It was that the choir could never harm anyone again, ever, and that the worlds it had spent 9 centuries terrorizing could now sail right through the heart of its dead fleet, without so much as a shiver, because the thing that had made the choir terrible was gone, and what remained was 400 ships full of lonely strangers who could only watch. The little gray ship stayed for a while. It sent no signal the throat could understand, but he watched it move slowly through the crescent, ship by ship, and he understood that it was counting, and that it was witnessing, and that it would carry what it saw back to its own quiet people, and that they would hear, and that something in them, that the choir had pressed flat 200 years before, would slowly, finally, begin to stand back up. Then the little ship folded away into the dark, carrying the story onward, and the throat was alone again, and he understood that he would watch this happen again and again, ship after ship, year after year, witnesses drawn to the place where the choir ended, none of them able to feel him, all of them free. Far below, on Tellin, the people had begun to send a signal. They did not know who would hear it. They did not know if anyone would. But they had spent a generation unable to speak, and now they could. And so they did the loud, primitive, human thing they had learned from the radio echoes of their saviors. They spoke plainly, in spoken words, on an old open frequency, into the dark. "This is Tellin," the signal said. "The lid is gone. We don't know how. We don't know who. But we are awake. And we are free, and we are sending this as far as it will go, so that any world still living under the song will know. It can end. It does end. Someone heard us. Someone came. Be loud. Stay loud. They are listening, even when you cannot feel them, and they are coming, even when you cannot believe it." The signal went out across the dark, slow and clear, and it passed the drifting silent crescent of the choir, on its way to the stars, and the throat heard it on his old optical-linked receiver, the one human-style sense the field had left him, and he understood that he was hearing the exact thing he had spent his whole life making certain no broken world could ever say. It can end. It does end. Someone came. The still hour reached the orbit of Tellin, and the people below looked up, and saw a single gray ship, hanging quiet in their newly opened sky, and they did not feel it, because there was nothing to feel. And that was the most beautiful thing of all. Aboard the still hour, in a room the size of a small chapel near the heart of the ship, Commander Elise Brandt set down the radio handset she had used to read 400 ships into silence, and she did not smile. There were 10,040 people aboard her ship, and not one of them cheered. This had been agreed long before they folded into the dark. There would be no cheering. The choir had cheered. The choir had saved a piece of itself to gloat with, every single time, and the whole point of the still hour, the whole reason Earth had spent 60 years and the lives of 3 quiet generations of engineers building a weapon out of silence, was to be the opposite of the choir in every way that mattered. So when the last bark fell into the field and the throat went dark, the crew of the still hour did the human thing. They sat at their stations, and they were tired, and they were glad it was over, and they let the silence they had made be the only sound in the dark. Brandt was not a young woman. She had spent 30 years of her life listening to the choir. That had been her whole career, her whole world. The the reason her hair had gone gray before its time. She had been a listener, one of the thousands of humans who sat in dim rooms on Earth and on the cold moons of the home system, headphones on, catching the faint old echoes of the choir's victories as they rippled across the dark years after the fact. She had heard 10,000 worlds die. She had heard the throat gloat over every one of them. She had heard the surrender songs, the slow flattening of a whole species into quiet, the moment in each one where the dying world finally understood that no help was coming and no one could hear it. She had heard it, and she had not been able to do anything for 30 years because there had been nothing to do. You cannot shout down a choir. She had learned that the way everyone learned it, by trying, in the early years, before Earth understood what it was facing. They had sent louder signals. They had sent fleets, once, a brave, foolish armada that had folded out to meet the choir mind to mind, and had been turned into a surrender song before it ever fired. Every captain weeping and thanking the choir, every gunner certain he had already lost. The choir had sent that surrender song back to Earth on purpose, so that Earth would hear its own fleet beg. Brant had been 26. She had heard it. She had never forgotten it. There had been a name for the lost armada, and Brant still carried it. It had been called the Open Hand, 60 ships sent out in the first years, as a gesture of peace, turned to defiance, crewed by the bravest people Earth could find, and it had been the worst mistake the human race ever made. The Open Hand had folded out to meet the choir believing that courage would be enough, that a fleet that would not break could simply refuse to break. It had not understood, yet, that the choir did not need you to break. It needed you to believe you had broken, and belief is not a thing courage can defend. 60 ships had sailed out, and 60 ships had come drifting home weeks later, intact, their crews alive and ruined. Every one of them carrying the certainty the choir had pressed into them. Every one of them sure to the end of his days that he had already lost every fight he would ever fight. Brant had grown up in the shadow of the Open Hand. Every one of her generation had. It was the wound at the center of the human century, the proof that the old human answer, be brave, stand firm, refuse to yield, did not work against an enemy that fought inside the mind itself. And it had taught the human race the hardest lesson it ever learned, which was that there are some fights you cannot win by being strong, and some you can only win by being patient, and quiet, and willing to spend 60 years building the one exact thing that ends the enemy for good. That was the day Earth stopped trying to be louder, and started trying to be quiet. It took 60 years. It took a generation of physicists who learned that the choir's song was not magic but a thing, a real reaching of mind across the dark, a signal like any other, and that any signal that can be sent can be jammed if you understand it well enough. It took a generation of engineers who built the emitters, thousands of them, woven through a hull, each one a small machine that did nothing but pour out the exact anti-shape of the choir's reaching, a silence so precise it canceled the song the way two waves cancel when the crest of one meets the trough of the other. It took the people of Earth deciding, together, in the loud, arguing human way, that they would not build a weapon to kill the choir, because killing the crews would have made Earth no better than the thing it fought. They would build a weapon to end the choir, to take from it the one thing it had taken from everyone else, and leave it alive to understand exactly what it had done. Brant had asked to command the ship. She had earned it. 30 years of listening had made her the human being who understood the choir best, and she had insisted on one thing, one single thing, that the others had argued about for a long time before they let her have it. She had insisted that the throat be left for last, and that she be the one to speak to him, and that she read it all to him in the plainest, calmest, most ordinary voice she could manage, because she had spent 30 years listening to that creature enjoy the deaths of worlds, and she had decided that the worst thing she could possibly do to it was to end it without enjoying it at all. There was a young officer beside her in the chapel-sized room, a signals lieutenant named Owen Hale, 24 years old, the same age Brant had been on the day she heard the Open Hand beg. He had done his part of the work flawlessly, holding the radio link steady across the whole battle, keeping the one plane frequency clean, so that Brant's voice could reach the choir in words it could not twist. When the last bark fell silent, Hale had looked at her, and she had seen in his young face the question that her own face must have carried 30 years before. The question every human asked the first time they truly understood what the choir had been. How could anything do that to a world? How could anything enjoy it? Brant had not answered the question, because there was no answer that helped. Instead, she had put her hand on the young officer's shoulder, the clumsy human way, the only way humans had ever had of saying, "I am here, you are not alone," across the wall that separated every mind from every other. It was such a small thing, a hand on a shoulder. The choir, with all its mighty shared room, had never once done anything so small, or so true, because the choir had never had to reach across a wall to touch another mind, and so it had never learned what the reaching was worth. The humans had spent 100,000 years learning, a hand on a shoulder, a voice on a radio, a ship that comes. It was all the same thing, and it was the thing the choir had never understood, and it was the thing that had just ended the choir forever. She had done that. It was done. She felt no triumph, and she had not expected to. She felt the way you feel when you have finally set down something very heavy that you have carried for so long you forgot it was heavy. She felt quiet. It was, she thought, the most human feeling there was, and the choir had never once felt it, because the choir had never once been quiet, and that, in the end, was why the choir had lost. She gave the order to hold orbit over Tellon, and to open every channel, and to listen. The signals came up from the surface, thousands of them, loud and overlapping and joyful and confused, 3 worlds full of people who could speak freely for the first time in a generation, and the crew of the Still Hour sat in their chapel-sized room near the heart of the ship and listened to a galaxy waking up. They did not answer, at first. They only listened. They had come a very long way to hear exactly this, and they let themselves hear it. Then Brant picked up the handset one more time, and she spoke to the 3 worlds in her weather report voice, and what she said was very short. "This is the ship that came," she said. "You don't need to know our name. You don't need to thank us. We only need you to do one thing. Stay loud. The choir is ended, but it was never the only quiet thing in the dark, and the only weapon that ever worked against it was a people who refused to believe they were alone. So be that. Be loud. Listen for the next world that needs you. And when you hear it, go." We did. That's all it ever takes. One ship that comes. She set the handset down for the last time, and the Still Hour held its quiet orbit, and far above it, in the field of silent ships, the throat drifted, and watched, and understood. He understood that this was how it would be now. Not for one battle, for always. The humans had not won a war. They had changed what war was. They had taken the oldest terror in the galaxy, the thing that ruled by making its victims feel alone, and they had ended it by being the one race that could not be made to feel alone. And then they had taught that lesson to 3 worlds, and those 3 worlds would teach it to others, and the others to others, until the whole galaxy knew the secret that the choir had spent 900 years murdering worlds to keep hidden. The secret was so simple that the throat could have wept, if weeping had been a draconian thing. The secret was that no one is ever as alone as the silence tells them they are, that the certainty of being alone is the lie at the center of every defeat, and that the lie can be broken by a single voice from the dark saying someone heard you, someone came. The choir had ruled by telling that lie to everyone. The humans had ended the choir by being living proof that it was a lie. And now the proof was loose in the galaxy, drifting up from 3 free worlds on 1,000 open frequencies, impossible to silence, because you cannot jam a galaxy that has decided to be loud. The Still Hour finished its work above Tellon, and Owari, and the Brace. It left small things behind, quiet human gifts, machines that would keep the lid from ever falling again, and listeners who would teach the 3 worlds how to hear the dark the human way, with patience and radios and plain words, instead of the warm shared room they had never had. Then it turned its gray prow back toward the deep, toward the long, slow fold home, toward Earth, where 10,040 families were waiting to hear that it was over. It passed the silent crescent of the choir one final time on its way out. The throat watched it come. He could do nothing else. He had spent days now in the silence, and he had stopped reaching for the room, because there was no room, and he had stopped reaching for the others, because there were no others, and he had begun, slowly, to do the only thing left to a mind that has nothing but itself. He had begun to think. Really think, for the first time in 900 years, without the warm crowd telling him what to think, without the song, without the certainty, he had begun to understand himself, and he did not like what he found, and the not liking was the only company he had, and he suspected, correctly, that it would be his only company for the rest of his very long life. The still hour drew level with his ship. For a moment, the two vessels hung close in the dark, the gray human warship and the silenced Draconian flagship, the present and the past, the people who came and the people who would never come for anyone again. And the radio crackled, one last time, on the old plane frequency. It was Brant. The throat knew her voice now. He would know it forever. She did not gloat. She did not sing. She read him his weather report, the last words any voice would ever say to him, in a tone as flat and calm as the silence she had made. "You called us weak," she said, "because we couldn't touch each other's minds. You called us loud, because we had to shout across the dark to be heard. You called us alone, because every one of us is walled up inside his own skull, with no way out but words. And you were right, we are alone. Every human who ever lived has been alone, from the first breath to the last, locked inside himself, reaching out with nothing but clumsy, slow words and hoping someone reaches back." She paused. The throat listened. He had nothing else to do, and nowhere else to be, and no one else in the universe. "But here is the thing you never understood," Brant said. "We learned to live with it. We learned to trust strangers we couldn't feel. We learned to come for worlds we'd never touched. We learned to be alone, together, in the dark, for 10,000 years. And it made us the only thing in this galaxy that your silence could never touch, because we were already living in it. You spent 900 years using loneliness as a weapon. We spent 100,000 years using it as a home, and when you finally met someone who was at home in the thing you used to kill, you lost everything, in 11 minutes, without a single sound." The throat closed his eyes. He had been keeping them open to watch the human ship. He found, now, that he no longer wished to watch it leave. "Sit in the quiet," Brant said. "We're not coming back. No one is. You wanted 10,000 worlds to feel what it was to be alone, with no one coming, no one listening, no one left. Now you know exactly what that feels like, and you've got forever to know it. And the only mercy you'll get is the one you never gave a single soul. We're not going to enjoy it. We're just going to leave." The radio went dead. The still hour lit its fold drive, the humankind, a machine of steel and fire and patient mathematics that needed no mind to steer it, that crossed the dark on numbers alone, that did not require a single living thing to reach out and hold it together, because the people who built it had always known they were alone, and had built accordingly. The fold opened, clean and bright, and the gray ship stepped into it, and was gone, on its way home, to a loud blue world that would be glad to have it back. The throat drifted in the silence it left behind. Around him, 400 ships hung in their perfect crescent, running lights still burning, crews still alive, every one of them alone, every one of them forever, beyond the reach of every other, a fleet of strangers, who had only ever known each other as voices, in a room that no longer existed. They would drift here for a long time, between two dead stars, in the place where the choir ended, and when the other races finally came, drawn by the story spreading loud across the dark, they would find no battle, no wreckage, no weapon, nothing to study, or fear, or copy. They would find only the silence, and the lesson written in it, the lesson the humans had carved into the bones of the galaxy without firing a shot. You do not mock the people who learn to live in the dark. You do not press your certainty onto a race that was born already alone. And you never ever assume that the quiet ship is the weak one, because sometimes, the quiet ship is the one that has come to make you understand, at long last and far too late, exactly how loud your silence is about to become. The throat sat in it. He had 900 years of memory of the warm crowd, the song, the room, the certainty, the worlds he had broken, and the pleasure he had taken in breaking them. He had all of that, perfectly preserved, with nothing to soften it, and no one to share it, and no end to it, but his own slow death, which would be a long time coming, because his ship worked, and his air worked, and the humans had made very sure he would live. The fold home took 11 days. Brant spent most of them in the chapel-sized room, listening, because that was what she had always done, and what she would always do. The signals came in from the three freed worlds, growing louder and more confident with each passing hour. And then, further out, came other signals, faint at first, then less faint. Worlds the choir had broken long ago, worlds that had drifted for generations under their own private songs. They were hearing the story now, a single gray ship, 400 warships, no battle, no sound, just an absence that arrived and stayed. And one by one, on 100 old frequencies, the leashed worlds of the galaxy began, very quietly, to wonder whether the certainty that held them down had ever been true. That was the thing Brant had wanted most, not the victory. The wondering. Because the wondering was the first crack, and a crack, once it starts, cannot be unstarted. And a galaxy full of cracks is a galaxy full of worlds, about to remember that they were never as alone as they had been told. The choir had spent 900 years sealing those cracks shut, world by world, certainty by certainty. The still hour had reopened all of them at once, with a single act of silence, and no force left in the universe could seal them again, because the thing that had sealed them was dead, drifting between two cold stars, and the thing that had opened them was a story, and you cannot kill a story that is true. When the still hour folded back into the home system, 11 days out from the dark, the whole of Earth was already listening for it. They had heard, by then. The slow, loud human network of radios and relays had carried the news home ahead of the ship, and a planet that had lived for 100 years in the shadow of the open hand, a planet that had grown up knowing that its bravest fleet had been turned into a surrender song and sent home to beg, had learned that the long patience was finally over. The choir was ended. The thing that had haunted the human century was gone, and it had been ended not by a braver fleet or a bigger gun, but by 60 years of quiet, careful, stubborn work, and by one gray ship, and by a tired gray-haired woman who read weather reports to monsters. Up in the silent dark, the throat went on understanding things. He had nothing else to do, and the last thing he understood was the thing the calm woman had not bothered to say, because she had known he would arrive at it himself, alone, the way humans arrive at every truth. He understood that this was not revenge. Revenge is loud, revenge gloats. Revenge saves a piece of itself to enjoy the moment with, the way the choir always had. This was something colder and cleaner and far more human than revenge. This was justice, handed down without anger, by a people who had simply decided that the choir's way of war would not be allowed to exist anymore, and who had ended it the way you end a sickness, and who had then gone home to their loud blue world and their waiting families, and had not thought about the throat again, not once, because he did not matter, and never had. That was the silence the humans left him. Not the silence of the dead room, the silence of not mattering, to the only minds left in the universe that could have heard him, the silence of being a finished chore in the memory of a people who had already moved on to the next world that needed saving. He would sit in it forever. There was a moment, on the day the still hour came home, that no one had planned, and no one ever forgot. The great gray ship folded into the home system and slid down toward the orbital docks above the loud blue world, and as it came, the people of Earth did the thing that people of Earth had always done, the thing the choir had spent 900 years mocking them for. They made noise. Every radio on the planet, every relay, every small ship and station and listening post opened at once and spoke, not in one voice, never in one voice, but in a billion overlapping voices. Welcome home. Welcome home. You came back. Welcome home. It was the loudest the home system had ever been, and there was no order to it, and no single mind behind it, and no certainty pressed into anyone, just a billion separate lonely people, each reaching across the wall between them, in the only clumsy way they had, all at once, to say the same thing. Brant stood at a viewport as the ship came in, and she listened to it, the great untidy roar of her whole species welcoming her home, and she thought about the throat drifting in his silence between two dead stars, and she felt no pity for him, because she had spent 30 years earning the right not to. But she did think one thing, one last time, and then she let it go. She thought that the choir had never once heard a sound like this. 900 years of song, and it had never made anything like the joyful, unplanned noise of a billion separate people glad to have one ship back. The choir's room had been warm and vast, and it had held every voice perfectly, and not one of those voices had ever had to reach for another, and so not one of them had ever known what the reaching was worth. The humans had spent their whole history reaching across the dark with nothing but words, and it had taught them the one thing the choir, for all its mighty silence and all its terrible song, had never learned and now never would. It had taught them that a voice is only precious because it has to cross a distance to be heard. And very far away, on a loud blue world, the still hour came home, and 10,040 families came down to the docks to meet it, and the dark between the stars filled, slowly and forever, with the loud and clumsy and unstoppable sound of a galaxy that had finally learned it was never alone.